The operation was never supposed to exist. Officially, no paperwork, no signatures, no authorization from the CIA director himself. And yet, in the fall of 1982, a handful of senior officers met behind closed doors in a soundproof room at Langley to discuss one of the most dangerous proposals ever placed on the table: the recruitment of a sitting Soviet general. His name was General Viktor Mikhailovich Sokolov, a man with a reputation for brilliance, unmatched discipline, and a deep understanding of Soviet military strategy. He oversaw logistics for several key divisions near the western border, which gave him access to mobilization plans, strategic deployments, fuel reserves, encrypted communication systems, and even early designs for new missile platforms. If the CIA could turn him, the entire balance of the Cold War might tilt overnight. But Sokolov was not just powerful, he was loyal, feared, and intensely aware that he was watched. The KGB kept a close eye on every member of the Soviet general staff, especially those with access to sensitive information. Recruiting someone of that rank was considered nearly impossible. But CIA analyst Daniel Carrington believed he had found a crack in the armor. Sokolov's son, his son Dmitry, had been arrested quietly 2 years earlier for ideological corruption, a vague charge usually meaning forbidden books, forbidden music, or forbidden ideas. The case never went public, but Carrington's team intercepted a coded message suggesting Sokolov had tried to intervene, only to be stonewalled by party officials. A father's humiliation, Langley argued, could be turned into motivation. The room stayed silent after Carrington finished his briefing. Everyone understood what was at stake. The Soviets executed traitors, and if the KGB even sensed an American attempt, the political consequences could be catastrophic. But the reward, the possibility of gaining insight into the inner workings of the Soviet war machine, was too great to ignore. The operation was approved in principle, but with one condition: absolute deniability. If anything went wrong, no one who authorized it would admit involvement. The CIA needed someone who could operate alone, improvise on the fly, and disappear into Moscow without leaving a trace. They chose Michael Wolf, a field officer with deep experience running assets in hostile territory. Wolf had lived in East Berlin, Tehran, and Leningrad. He knew how the KGB thought, how they followed, how they trapped. His mission was simple in design, impossible in execution: establish contact with Sokolov without being noticed, test his vulnerability, and determine whether he was a potential asset or a danger to anyone who approached him. Wolf arrived in Moscow under diplomatic cover a week later. He carried forged documents, a miniature encryption device hidden inside a lighter, and a cover identity that had taken 5 years to build. But as soon as he stepped into Sheremetyevo airport, he felt the familiar weight of being watched. In Moscow, the KGB didn't wait for mistakes. They created them. For his first week, Wolf did nothing but observe. He memorized faces in crowds, studied who lingered near embassy vehicles, who followed embassy staff home, who waited outside familiar cafes. The surveillance was professional, disciplined, and relentless. If he was going to reach Sokolov, he would need a moment when the general broke routine, a moment rare enough to be noticed. That moment came unexpectedly on a frozen morning near Kutuzovsky Prospect. Sokolov, known for his rigid punctuality, emerged from the ministry building nearly 30 minutes late, visibly agitated and without his usual escort. He climbed into a black Volga and drove west, not toward home, not toward the Kremlin, but toward a nondescript residential district with aging 5-story buildings. Wolf followed at a safe distance. Sokolov parked near a small brick house and entered without knocking. Inside lived a woman in her 60s, Sokolov's sister, according to CIA background files. She had been a school teacher before retiring early due to illness. Records suggested the general visited her rarely, yet here he was, pale, restless, and carrying a folder under his coat. Wolf observed from across the street, pretending to adjust the cuff of his glove while memorizing every detail. Something had happened, something big enough to disrupt the life of a man who never broke protocol. And then Wolf saw it. A second car, this one old and Soviet blue, pulled up slowly behind him. 2 men stepped out, not neighbors, not passers-by. KGB. They weren't looking at the house. They were looking directly at him. The 2 men stood just far enough away to avoid drawing attention. Yet their posture revealed everything Wolf feared. One leaned against the blue car, as if simply waiting for someone. The other adjusted his coat, pretending to smoke. But their eyes never drifted. They were locked on Wolf, with the patience of hunters who already knew their prey had nowhere to run. Wolf forced himself not to react. Any sudden movement would be the confirmation they needed. He turned his back to them slowly. as if he had finished, examining the frost on the windowsill of the apartment building behind him, and began walking toward the nearest tram stop. His heartbeat echoed in his ears, but his pace remained calm, almost casual. He counted to 5 before checking his reflection in a darkened store window. One of the men followed 20 meters behind. The other circled around the block, moving parallel to him. Standard KGB formation. They weren't here for Sokolov. They were here for him. The obvious question was why. He hadn't made contact with the general. He hadn't even approached the house. He had followed at a distance, used no signal, triggered no pre-arranged meeting. Yet somehow they had anticipated where he would be. Unless, Wolf thought, this wasn't coincidence, it was orchestration. He boarded the tram just as the bell chimed. The two men boarded as well, pretending to argue about the fare. Moscow commuters barely noticed. Arguments about fares were as common as the icy wind. Blowing through the cracked windows, Wolf stood near the rear exit, gripping the leather strap above him, letting the tram jolt him from side to side as it clattered across metal rails. He rehearsed the next steps in his mind. There were escape routes he could use, alley systems, service tunnels, markets where crowds swallowed you whole. But using any of them now would confirm guilt. He had to remain predictable. Predictability meant normalcy, and normalcy meant survival. He exited at the next major stop, joining a stream of office workers heading toward Kutuzovsky Prospect. The KGB men followed, but not aggressively. They wanted him to feel pressure, not panic. Panic made people sloppy. Pressure made them reveal intentions. Wolf ducked into a small grocery store, letting the warmth and smell of oranges wash over him. He pretended to inspect a row of canned goods while observing the reflection on a polished metal panel near the counter. The men were waiting outside, one leaning on a lamppost, the other pretending to check a newspaper. He clearly couldn't read in the freezing wind. He knew he needed to disappear, at least long enough to warn Langley. But communications had been restricted. Moscow was the most hostile environment on Earth for a CIA officer. Every transmission risked detection. Every coded message risked interception. And if the KGB had tagged him already, any signal could be his last. He left the store with a small paper bag. One of the KGB men glanced at it with brief confusion. Nothing inside seemed suspicious. A loaf of bread, a packet of cigarettes, a tin of soup, exactly the kind of purchases a diplomat might make on a cold winter afternoon. The normalcy of it worked in Wolf's favor. They followed more loosely now. As he walked along the boulevard, Wolf realized something far more troubling. They weren't trying to arrest him. If they wanted that, they would have done it quietly and efficiently, without witnesses. No, they wanted him to keep moving, to follow a path they had already predicted. And that meant only one thing. They wanted him to lead them to someone. Sokolov. The realization hit Wolf harder than the wind. The general's sudden deviation from routine, the unplanned visit to his sister, the folder he carried under his coat. It all pointed toward a man under pressure, under suspicion, or perhaps already compromised. Wolf turned down a side street, pretending to stop and tie his boot. He used the moment to think. If the KGB believed he was connected to Sokolov, then the situation was already far more dangerous than Langley imagined. It meant one of two things. Either the general's circle had leaked information, or someone inside Moscow Station had made a mistake. Neither option ended well. He rose to his feet and continued walking. 10 minutes later, he reached a small underpass beneath a railway line. This was the only point. Along his route where the KGB surveillance would be forced to regroup. Narrow passageways complicated tailing. Shadows distorted depth perception. And noise from the trains masked footsteps. Wolf stepped inside the underpass, the sound of steel wheels roaring overhead. The dim yellow lights flickered. Water dripped from the concrete ceiling. This was the moment. He slowed his pace slightly. Let them draw closer. Let them think he was preparing to turn around or confront them. And then, in complete stillness, Wolf slipped his hand into his coat and pulled a small folded piece of paper from an inner pocket. A micro-coded message, prepared for emergencies only. It wasn't meant to be read. It was meant to be placed. Without breaking stride, he pressed it beneath a rusted metal cabinet bolted to the wall, a location known only to one person in the world. The CIA cutout responsible for dead drops in Moscow. If Sokolov was in danger, Langley had to know immediately. Wolf exited the underpass and stepped back into the cold air. But this time, he saw something that froze him to the bone. There were not 2 KGB officers anymore. There were 6. They were no longer pretending to argue or smoke or check newspapers. They were walking directly toward him. And for the first time since he entered the Soviet Union, Michael Wolf understood that Operation Glass Shadow had already slipped out of control. The doors of the secure wing closed behind Richard with a heavy metallic thud. The corridor smelled faintly of cold metal and stale paper, a place where secrets age slowly, like forbidden wine. He walked past rooms without windows, each one lit by a single buzzing fluorescent lamp. Behind these doors, he knew, were analysts who spent their entire lives reading fragments of conversations, decoding half-broken ciphers, and guessing what the KGB might be planning before the KGB itself even knew. At the very end of the corridor, in a room protected by 2 layers of clearance, sat the man Richard least wanted to see today, Deputy Director Harold Wilcox, a living fossil of the Cold War. Wilcox had the permanent expression of someone who had seen the world burn more than once. When Richard entered, Wilcox didn't look up right away. He finished signing a document, placed his pen down with exaggerated precision, and only then raised his eyes. "Close the door," he said. No greeting, no courtesy. That was how Wilcox showed respect. None at all. Richard shut the door and remained standing. Wilcox gestured toward the chair. "Sit. We don't have time for ceremony." The projector on the table hummed to life, throwing a blurry black and white photograph onto the wall. A Soviet officer shaking hands with an American man whose face was half hidden in shadow. Richard felt his stomach tighten. "That image," Wilcox said, "was delivered to us anonymously. We believe it shows a leak, someone from our side meeting with a KGB liaison in Helsinki 3 weeks ago." Richard leaned in. "Do we have an ID?" Wilcox clicked the next slide. A close-up of the American's face. It was grainy but clear enough. Richard felt ice spreading through his chest. He recognized the man. It was Agent Douglas Crane, one of the CIA's most trusted counterintelligence officers. The man who, ironically, was responsible for hunting Soviet moles. Richard forced himself to speak. "This could be a setup. The KGB has staged worse." Wilcox gave him a long, sharp look. "Could be. Or maybe we've had a ghost inside our own walls for a decade. Someone feeding the Soviets intelligence about our crypto systems, our global operations, even our internal probes. And if that's true, then every mission you've ever worked on may already be compromised." The words hit Richard harder than he expected. He had always known betrayal was a possibility. But to see the face of someone he respected, someone he had trained with, it felt like the floor had shifted beneath him. Wilcox muted the projector and turned on the lamp between them, casting an amber glow across the room. "Your assignment is simple on paper and impossible in reality. You're going to verify whether Crane is the traitor or whether the KGB is setting us up." Richard swallowed. "And if he is the traitor?" Wilcox didn't blink. "Then you neutralize him, quietly, quickly, before the KGB extracts the last pieces of whatever he still knows." There was no reaction, no dramatic pause, just protocol. But Richard felt a sudden heaviness in his lungs. Crane wasn't just a colleague, he was a friend, someone he had shared operations with, someone who had risked his life more than once for the agency. "And if the KGB is framing him?" Richard asked. "Then you find out who orchestrated it. Because a frame like this means they're preparing for something big." Wilcox slid a sealed envelope across the desk. Inside were surveillance photos, operational notes, Crane's recent travel logs, and something unexpected, a handwritten note from an unnamed informant claiming Crane was the key to the Soviets' next move. Richard looked up. "Sir, who is the informant?" "We don't know. They call themselves Glassbird. They've provided intel twice before, accurate both times. But their agenda is unknown." Glassbird. The codename hung in the air like a phantom. Wilcox stood, signaling the meeting was over. "You leave tonight. Berlin. That's the last place." Crane was spotted off record. He paused, then added, "Be careful, Richard. If Crane really is working with the KGB, he won't hesitate. And if he's not, then someone out there wants you dead before you find out the truth." Richard nodded and left the room, the envelope tucked under his arm like a condemned letter. As he walked back down the long corridor, he felt something he had not felt in years. The distinct electric pressure of walking into a trap, one without edges, without a map, and without any guarantee he would walk out again. Berlin in February was a city divided by ice and suspicion. The streets were slick with melted snow, the air biting, carrying faint odors of coal smoke and diesel from the endless lines of military vehicles. Michael Wolff arrived at Tegel Airport under his diplomatic cover, passport forged to perfection, carrying the sealed envelope from Langley and a sense of foreboding he could not shake. Every glance felt magnified, every shadow suspicious. The city was a chessboard, and he was entering with all the pieces hidden from view. Wolff took a black Volga waiting for him near the arrivals gate. an innocuous sedan blending seamlessly with East German traffic. The driver, a local asset trained by the CIA, didn't speak much, only nodded once as Wolf handed over the envelope. Inside were detailed instructions for the next stage: locate Douglas Crane, confirm his status, and determine whether he had truly defected or was being manipulated. Langley's note emphasized discretion. No arrests, no confrontations. Information only. The streets of Berlin felt unusually empty. It was the kind of silence that wasn't silence at all, but a pressure in the air, heavy and expectant. Wolf noticed every unmarked car, every figure observing from shop windows. KGB agents worked in teams, moving like shadows, coordinating silently. To Wolf, it felt like the entire city was anticipating a single move, his move. He reached a small safe house in Mitte, a building that had once been a bakery. Its front windows were frosted over, and the door squeaked as he pushed it open. Inside, the room was heated just enough to take the bite out of the February chill. A single lamp illuminated a metal table, on which several black and white photographs had been placed. Each photo showed Douglas Crane in various locations over the past month. Cafes, train stations, embassies. Crane was meticulous, but even the meticulous made mistakes. Wolf began cross-referencing dates, times, and locations. One image stood out: Crane exiting a Soviet-owned shipping warehouse near the Spree River, carrying a briefcase that appeared ordinary to any observer but was highly suspicious in context. Wolf marked it for investigation. He felt the first real stirrings of danger, the sense that he wasn't merely observing. He was being observed, led into a larger trap. Suddenly, a faint noise at the back of the building caught his attention. A door creaking, footsteps approaching. Wolf froze. The safe house had no other expected occupants. Carefully, he moved toward a shadowed corner, blending into the dimness. The door opened slightly, revealing a figure in civilian clothes, carrying a small envelope. Wolf's heart skipped. Another operative? Or a trap? The figure spoke in Russian, quietly. "Are you Wolf?" The accent was imperfect, but the caution unmistakable. Wolf nodded, motioning for the man to enter. He closed the door behind him, the muffled sound of Berlin's streets fading into a low hum. The man handed Wolf the envelope. Inside was a single photograph of Douglas Crane, standing next to General Sokolov, the same man Wolf had been tracking in Moscow. The photo appeared recent. Wolf felt a chill. This wasn't old intelligence. This was live. Crane was not acting alone. Sokolov's presence indicated that the recruitment attempt had moved further than Langley anticipated. The CIA's plan was already in motion, and the KGB might already know. The man spoke again, voice low. "This changes everything. If Crane succeeds in gaining Sokolov's cooperation, the Americans could have access to strategic plans before anyone notices. But the Soviets are aware of an anomaly. Someone is feeding information from inside." Wolf considered the implications. If the KGB had detected even a minor signal, they could lay a trap using Crane as bait. The danger was exponential. One wrong move could cost lives and compromise an entire network. He carefully folded the photograph, tucking it inside his coat. Every instinct screamed caution. Wolf knew he needed to observe Crane without contact for now. Any approach risked exposure, and once the KGB sensed an intrusion, the entire operation would unravel. The streets of Berlin were not neutral. They were a battlefield of shadows. That evening, Wolf positioned himself near a tram stop along the river, watching a narrow street where Crane had been reported to emerge. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows. Figures moved through the mist, silhouettes blending with the cityscape. Every movement could be a threat. Every passerby a potential KGB agent. Wolf adjusted his coat, keeping his hands visible. A casual observer in a city that scrutinized every detail. Hours passed. The tram rolled to a stop. A man in a heavy coat stepped off, briefcase in hand, walking confidently but cautiously. Wolf's heart tightened. Douglas Crane, everything from Langley, everything Wolf had prepared for, depended on observing him without being observed. He followed, using the fog as cover, moving through back alleys and empty courtyards. The night closed around them like a shroud. The trap could be anywhere, and Wolf had to assume the Soviets anticipated every step. This was no longer a simple intelligence operation. It was a game of survival. A deadly ballet in which a single misstep could ignite consequences that neither Moscow nor Washington could contain. The fog thickened as the night deepened, turning Berlin into a labyrinth of gray shapes and distant echoes. Wolf kept moving, blending into the shadows, each step measured, each breath controlled. The streets were empty of civilians this late, the occasional streetlight flickering weakly against the mist. But he knew better than to trust the emptiness. Every empty street in East Berlin could hide a KGB surveillance team. waiting silently for him to make a single mistake. Douglas Crane moved with a purpose that betrayed no hesitation. Wolf followed at a distance, careful to remain in the mist's cover. The general movements of both men were deliberate, but Wolf noticed subtle changes. Crane occasionally glanced over his shoulder, adjusted the strap on his briefcase, or slowed momentarily as if listening. Every gesture screamed caution. The CIA's instructions were clear: no contact until confirmation of the asset. Wolf had to observe, but the tension was unbearable. One wrong step, one glance in the wrong direction, and the KGB would know exactly who he was. Wolf's thoughts raced. Crane's meeting with Sokolov in Moscow, the intercepted photo, the Langley envelope, all pointed to a network deeper than they had imagined. This wasn't a casual recruitment attempt. It was a high-stakes infiltration, designed to manipulate strategic decisions at the very heart of the Soviet military. And now, the operation was unfolding in Berlin, where every shadow could be a spy, every reflection in a window a threat. They reached a small courtyard behind a nondescript building near the Spree River. Crane paused, surveying the area as if expecting someone. Wolf crouched behind a dumpster, scanning every exit. The courtyard was empty, but the tension was suffocating. Then, from a doorway at the far end, two figures emerged, moving silently. Uniforms were absent, but the posture, the measured steps revealed them immediately. KGB agents. Crane hesitated, his hand moving instinctively toward the briefcase. Wolf could see the tension in his shoulders, the slight shake of his gloved fingers. The KGB approached deliberately, almost leisurely, but Wolf knew better. This was a trap in progress. He considered his options. The only way to survive without blowing his cover was to maintain distance, let the interaction unfold, and gather as much intelligence as possible. Direct confrontation was suicide. If Crane was truly compromised, any move could trigger an extraction or a lethal ambush. Wolf's training kicked in, forcing his body to stay still, mind racing. The KGB agents reached Crane and spoke quietly, their voices low, almost indistinguishable over the hum of a distant tram. Crane's expression didn't change, but Wolf could see the subtle tension in his stance. Whatever was being said, the CIA operative did not resist. He only nodded once, then handed over the briefcase. Wolf's stomach sank. The handover confirmed everything Langley feared. Crane was either cooperating willingly with the Soviets or was under duress, but either scenario meant the mission had escalated beyond recovery. Wolf understood the gravity. Every document, every piece of intelligence carried by Crane could now be compromised. And with Sokolov potentially involved, the ramifications could stretch far beyond Berlin or Moscow. Wolf remained in the shadows as the KGB agents walked away with the briefcase. The fog swallowed them almost immediately, leaving him alone in the courtyard. He exhaled slowly, his breath misting in the cold air. He had observed, he had recorded, and he had survived. But the victory was hollow. The KGB had retained control, and the CIA's Operation Glass Shadow, was teetering on the brink of collapse. He retraced his steps through the alleys, careful to erase any trace of his presence. Every streetlight, every puddle of water, every shadow of a passerby could betray him. Wolf knew that by dawn, Langley would receive incomplete intelligence, but enough to understand the depth of the compromise. Crane's status would need confirmation. Sokolov's intentions would have to be assessed, and the KGB's manipulations untangled. Back in his safe house, Wolf finally allowed himself a moment to sit. The cold had seeped into his bones, the tension into his mind. He spread out the photographs, notes, and coded messages. Patterns began to emerge, connections he hadn't seen before. The Soviets were not merely reacting, they were orchestrating a counter-operation that anticipated every American move. They had predicted Wolf's arrival, Crane's behavior, and even the timing of the Langley communications. It was a level of strategic foresight that was both terrifying and brilliant. Wolf leaned back and closed his eyes for a brief moment. The night outside Berlin was long, filled with the hum of unseen vehicles, the distant whistles of trains, and the echo of footsteps he could not identify. Operation Glass Shadow had not failed completely, but it had revealed vulnerabilities the CIA had never anticipated. The line between hunter and hunted had blurred, and in the shadows, every decision carried the weight of lives, nations, and history itself. When Wolf opened his eyes, he knew there was no turning back. The next phase would require precision, patience, and a willingness to operate on the edge of catastrophe. The game was far from over, and Berlin had shown him just how lethal the shadows could be. The Cold War was not won by force, Wolf thought. It was won by information, by anticipation, and by the terrifying patience of those who never blinked first. The dawn in Berlin was pale and gray, the city shivering under a frost, that made even the most mundane details seem sharp and threatening. Michael Wolff emerged from the safe house just as the first trams clattered along the rails. His mind raced, replaying the events of the previous night. Crane's handover to the KGB, the silent efficiency of the agents, the patterns Wolff had begun to trace. It was all too precise. The Soviets weren't just responding, they were controlling the narrative. Wolff knew he had to act fast. Langley would expect detailed reports, but the information had to be confirmed and contextualized. He moved quickly, blending into a sparse crowd near Alexanderplatz. Winter coats muffled the bulk of movement, and the fog lent him a cover few spies could enjoy. Still, every sense screamed caution. One misstep, one glance from a passerby who wasn't a civilian, and the operation could collapse entirely. He headed toward a small cafe that had been identified as a neutral meeting point for American informants in Berlin. It was dimly lit, warm, and smelled faintly of roasted coffee and stale bread. Mundane, ordinary, unremarkable. Inside, a single figure waited in a corner booth. The man, codenamed Hawk, was an East German asset trained by the CIA, tasked with relaying intelligence from operatives in the field. Hawk's eyes flicked up as Wolff approached, scanning him with the practiced wariness of someone who had survived too many winters in Moscow and Berlin alike. "You saw it?" Hawk whispered, once Wolff sat opposite him. "I did," Wolff replied, placing a gloved hand over the envelope containing Crane's recent movements and the photograph of Sokolov. Crane handed the briefcase to the KGB. Sokolov's involved, either coerced or complicit. The Soviets orchestrated the encounter. They knew we'd follow, they knew I'd observe. Everything points to a trap. Hawk's face was pale under the dim light. Langley is aware? They will be, but not fast enough. The information will reach them, but incomplete. By the time they understand the extent of the compromise, the Soviets may have already exploited Crane's access. Hawk leaned back, voice low. "You know what this means, right? If Sokolov is compromised, the CIA's network in Moscow is at risk. Assets could be extracted, operations dismantled, and anyone associated with Crane could be exposed. Langley may lose years of intelligence work in days." Wolff didn't respond immediately. He thought of all the contacts, operatives, and analysts who had put themselves in Moscow, trusting the protocols, trusting the cover identities. All of them were vulnerable if the Soviets fully understood the operation. He felt the weight of responsibility settle like a lead coat around his shoulders. "We need to verify Crane's intentions before anyone takes action," Wolff said finally. "If he's compromised, we can't risk confronting him directly. The KGB is watching every move. The wrong step, and we lose everything." Hawk nodded. "And if he isn't? Then someone else is setting him up. Either way, we're deep in enemy territory. Extraction won't be clean, and surveillance won't be perfect. The KGB has already demonstrated the precision of their control." They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the muted sounds of Berlin waking, distant footsteps, the low rumble of trams, the faint hiss of steam escaping from heating pipes. Every ordinary sound was layered with hidden potential threats, every shadow a possible agent waiting to strike. Wolff knew that he had to continue moving, to gather data, to follow Crane without triggering the KGB's next maneuver. Each observation had to be precise, deliberate, and silent. Hawk reached into his coat and handed Wolff a small radio transmitter, calibrated for short bursts. "If things go south, this is your lifeline. One signal, and Langley will know your position. But use it only if you have no other choice. The Soviets can triangulate signals faster than we anticipate." Wolff nodded. He tucked the device carefully into an inner pocket, feeling its weight both reassuring and dangerous. Every tool carried risk in this city. Every decision was measured in seconds. Every second possibly the difference between life and death. By midday, Wolff had tracked Crane to a series of nondescript government buildings along the spree, the general movements, the brief interactions with unknown figures, the subtle exchanges of documents encoded, messages, all painted a picture of a larger operation than Langley had predicted. The KGB's orchestration was meticulous. They anticipated every observation, every analysis Wolff could make, every possible guess he could form. And Wolff realized, as he paused behind a fogged-up bus shelter, that Operation Glass Shadow was no longer just a recruitment mission. It had evolved into a deadly chess match, one in which the CIA was simultaneously the hunter, the observer, and the potential pawn. He pulled his coat tighter against the cold and continued following Crane, silently calculating the next steps, knowing that at any moment, the fog, the streets, or the agents themselves could turn the entire mission into a catastrophe. The Cold War was not a battle of armies. It was a war of shadows, of secrets, of anticipation, and Wolf had just entered its deadliest chapter. The streets of East Berlin were quieter now, the pale winter sun struggling to pierce the low-hanging clouds. Michael Wolf moved deliberately, every step calculated, blending into the frozen flow of commuters and morning traffic. Douglas Crane had been observed entering a nondescript office building near the river, and Wolf had tracked him from a safe distance. But the atmosphere felt different now. He could sense the KGB closing in, and it wasn't just surveillance anymore. It was orchestration. Wolf ducked into an alley that allowed him a clear line of sight to the building's entrance. The light fog clung to the ground, swirling around the feet of people hurrying past, oblivious to the game being played around them. He adjusted his coat, checking the envelope from Langley. Every piece of intelligence it contained was crucial. Every photograph and code snippet a potential lifeline. Inside the building, Crane moved with a precision that suggested training far beyond a civilian background. He spoke quietly with a middle-aged man in a Soviet uniform, gesturing subtly toward the briefcase he had delivered the night before. Wolf recognized the gestures from previous Langley training materials, a coded conversation masked as ordinary speech. He strained to catch details, aware that the KGB might have already detected his presence. Two men emerged from a side corridor and passed through the main lobby. Without drawing attention, Wolf's eyes narrowed. They were clean-cut, unremarkable, but their posture and subtle scanning movements betrayed their true role. The KGB had anticipated every possibility, predicting Wolf's actions, guiding him into observing exactly what they wanted him to see. He realized with a cold clarity that he was no longer the hunter. The KGB had rewritten the rules, and he was now a participant in their design. He retreated to a safe vantage point across the street, crouching behind a parked vehicle. From here, he could watch the main entrance, the side exits, and the flow of pedestrians. He reviewed everything in his mind, the photographs, the notes, the Langley directives, and considered what the Soviets might already know. Every moment of Crane's day was being monitored. Every subtle movement, every hand gesture, every conversation carefully scrutinized. Wolf understood that even the tiniest misstep could unravel the operation entirely. Crane exited the building briefly, glancing around as if checking for tails. He carried nothing in his hands, yet his demeanor was tense, controlled, aware. Wolf followed at a distance, keeping to the shadows, aware that even the fog offered little protection. If the KGB had triangulated his position, the streetlights reflected in the wet pavement, and Wolf noticed the slight shimmer of a camera lens concealed. In the corner of a shop window, they were watching, always watching. The general picture was emerging. Crane was either fully compromised or being manipulated as part of a larger KGB strategy. The operation that Langley had envisioned, a direct recruitment of Sokolov through Crane, was no longer a simple extraction or observation. It had become a test of patience, skill, and nerve. Every second counted, and the margin for error had evaporated entirely. Wolf adjusted his grip on the inner pocket where the micro-coded message from Langley was kept. If things went wrong, he would signal. But that was a last resort. The Soviets could trace the signal, and any overt move risked exposure, not only of himself but of the entire American network in Moscow and Berlin. One wrong signal, and the operation would collapse into a cascade of compromises, each more devastating than the last. Crane turned into a narrow side street. Wolf followed, keeping just enough distance to remain unseen, but close enough to observe. The street was lined with abandoned warehouses, shuttered windows and rusted gates. Every step echoed in the quiet, a subtle threat of exposure. Wolf knew this was a calculated move. The Soviets had chosen the location with care, possibly to test him, possibly to control the timing of events. Either way, the game had shifted. Suddenly, a car engine hummed behind him. Wolf glanced reflexively, noting the license plate and make, an unmarked Lada. The driver's face partially obscured by frost on the windshield. The KGB were tightening the net. He didn't panic. He never panicked. Years of training, of operating under pressure, had taught him the value of controlled observation. The car slowed to a crawl, following him without drawing attention. Wolf's pulse quickened slightly. They were waiting for him to act. At the far end of the street, Crane stopped and leaned against a wall, checking over his shoulder. Wolf crouched behind a corner, carefully noting the exact position and movements. He realized this was an opportunity and a risk. If he moved closer, he could gather the confirmation Langley needed. If he stayed hidden, he could preserve operational security. Every option carried consequences that extended far beyond Berlin's streets. Wolf took a slow breath and decided he would maintain observation for now. recording Crane's interactions and movements while remaining undetected. The KGB's patience and precision were formidable, but Wolf's training matched theirs. The balance of this shadow game rested on subtlety, anticipation, and the ability to remain invisible while seeing everything. As he settled into his position, the fog shifted, curling around streetlights and corners. Wolf knew that the next hour would be critical. Operation Glass Shadow had entered its most dangerous phase, and Berlin was now a stage for a game that neither side could afford to lose. One wrong move, one missed signal, and decades of intelligence work could be destroyed in an instant. The gray afternoon in Berlin thickened into a muted dusk, shadows stretching long across empty streets. Wolf remained hidden in the alleyway, his eyes never leaving Crane. The general moved with calculated precision, his steps measured, deliberate, as if rehearsing every motion to avoid detection. Wolf understood immediately. Crane knew he was being watched, or at least suspected someone was following. The subtle checks over his shoulder, the careful pauses, the way he adjusted his coat, all signs of a man trained for surveillance, either by the CIA or under the KGB's careful tutelage. Wolf's radio transmitter rested inside his inner pocket, silent, unused. Sending a signal would have revealed his position, and with the KGB closing in, any movement had to be careful. Every breath, every slight shift of weight could betray him. He checked the edges of the alley, noting escape routes, fallback points, and potential dead drops he could use if things went wrong. Every route was calculated, every possibility accounted for. But even the best-laid plans had to bend under the weight of unforeseen variables. Crane entered a narrow building with a black painted door. Unmarked, ordinary in appearance but significant in function. Wolf took up a position across the street, crouched behind a row of parked cars, scanning the surroundings. Windows, doors, shadows, everything mattered. He could sense the invisible eyes of the KGB, hidden cameras, agents positioned on rooftops and behind curtains, anticipating every step. It was a theater of precision, and Wolf was trapped in the middle, the audience unseen. He observed Crane interact with two men in civilian clothing. The gestures were brief, almost imperceptible. A nod, a brief exchange of a package, a subtle shift of a hand. The significance of these movements was enormous. This was no casual meeting. Every action was coded, part of a communication network designed to transmit information while remaining hidden from all, but those trained to interpret it. Wolf recognized the patterns from Langley's intelligence briefings. Dead drops, prearranged signals, coordinated timing. It was a masterclass in espionage, executed flawlessly. Suddenly, Wolf noticed movement in the shadows behind him, a second set of eyes, reflecting faintly in the low light. He froze, heart racing, and recognized the posture immediately. KGB surveillance. They had been trailing him, waiting for the right moment to corner him or manipulate the situation. Wolf did not flinch. He was trained for moments like this. Slowly, he adjusted his coat, shifting his weight to maintain balance while remaining as inconspicuous as possible. He considered his options. Engaging would be suicidal. Retreating could compromise the observation. The only course was patience. Observation without interference. Gathering intelligence while remaining invisible. And most importantly, understanding that the KGB's patience was far longer than his own. They had time. Wolf had to act as if he did too. Minutes stretched, the cold pressing against him, fog curling through the streets, dampening sound and softening edges. Crane departed the building, briefcase in hand, moving toward a parked vehicle. Wolf followed at a calculated distance, noting license plates, pedestrian patterns, and the positions of potential KGB observers. Everything was a signal, everything a piece of the puzzle. One misstep could unravel the entire operation. The vehicle stopped near a bridge, overlooking the Spree River. Crane handed the briefcase to a man inside, who nodded silently and drove off. Wolf traced the vehicle with his eyes as it disappeared into the gray cityscape. The handover confirmed his fears. The KGB had already integrated Crane into their intelligence apparatus, either by coercion or deception. Langley's worst-case scenarios were materializing in real time. Wolf exhaled slowly, forcing himself to remain calm. The KGB had executed a counter-operation that anticipated every move, every thought, every observation he could make. And yet, he was not defeated. He had documentation, notes, photographs, and a real-time understanding of the operation's dynamics. The information he gathered tonight could still give Langley a fighting chance, but only if transmitted carefully and interpreted correctly. He moved toward a safe location across the river, blending into shadows, aware that every streetlight could conceal an observer, every pedestrian a potential informant. The city seemed to pulse with silent energy, a heartbeat of surveillance and secrecy. Wolf knew that the next phase of Operation Glass Shadow would demand precision beyond anything he had faced, confirming Crane's allegiance, assessing Sokolov's role, and predicting the KGB's next move without tipping his own hand. As he paused briefly to survey the river, watching the black waters swirl beneath the steel bridge, Wolf realized that Berlin had become more than just a city. It was a battlefield of intellect, patience, and courage. Every move, every signal, every observation mattered. Failure was not an option. Lives depended on discretion, skill, and the ability to operate invisibly within a system designed to crush anyone who dared to infiltrate it. And Wolf understood, with a cold clarity, that the operation had already entered a stage from which there would be no simple return. Every decision would carry weight. Every observation could become a decisive factor. Operation Glass Shadow was no longer a test. It was survival, executed in silence, in shadows, in the gray, frozen streets of a city where one mistake could alter the course of history. The night deepened over Berlin, the city cloaked in fog and silence, broken only by the distant hum of trams and the occasional clatter of boots on wet cobblestones. Michael Wolff moved with deliberate care, every step measured, every shadow scanned. Douglas Crane's movements over the past 2 days had revealed the outlines of a complex network, a combination of dead drops, coded meetings, and subtle exchanges of information. Wolff knew the KGB had orchestrated much of what he had observed. The city itself had become a stage for espionage, and he had been forced to play his part. He crouched behind a low brick wall near the riverbank, observing Crane as he approached a small warehouse. The building was nondescript, its facade weathered, windows dark and unremarkable. Yet Wolff knew better than to trust appearances. The KGB excelled at turning ordinary locations into deadly traps, carefully controlling sightlines, escape routes, and observation posts. Every moment Crane spent here was orchestrated to be both visible and invisible. Impossible balance for anyone not trained in Soviet counterintelligence methods. Crane paused at the doorway, glanced around, and entered. Wolff waited several heartbeats, listening to the faint sounds of movement inside. The scuff of shoes, the soft murmur of voices, the click of a briefcase being set down. His instincts screamed caution. This was more than an operational meeting. This was a controlled environment designed to expose or manipulate. He had to remain unseen, yet capture every possible detail. Using a series of mirrors and reflective surfaces positioned at calculated angles, Wolff observed the interior indirectly. He noted the number of individuals present, their positions, and their movements. 2 men in plain clothes stood near the back, exchanging documents with Crane in precise, almost ritualized motions. The interaction was subtle but significant. Each movement, each gesture, conveyed information, strategy, or confirmation, a language Wolff had learned to read. Minutes stretched, the fog pressing in like a living presence. Wolff's mind raced, reconstructing patterns from Langley's intelligence, comparing them with real-time observation. It became clear the KGB had integrated Crane into a broader counterintelligence operation. They were testing the CIA's ability to anticipate, respond, and adapt. And every move Wolff had made so far had been anticipated. He took careful note of an additional detail: a man stationed on a nearby rooftop, binoculars trained on the warehouse's front. This was a level of coordination Wolff hadn't expected. The KGB were not merely reacting. They were orchestrating, controlling the environment, predicting every possible American response. The precision was unnerving, yet impressive. The depth of Soviet surveillance infrastructure revealed itself in these small, calculated observations. Wolff retreated to a safer vantage point, using the shadows of adjacent buildings to obscure his movements. He considered Langley's next steps: confirmation of Crane's allegiance, assessment of Sokolov's involvement, and communication of intelligence. Without alerting the KGB, each decision carried consequences measured not in hours or days, but in seconds. A single misstep could compromise decades of intelligence work. He activated a micro-camera concealed within his coat, capturing images of Crane and the warehouse interior. These images would be transmitted securely to Langley during the briefest window of opportunity. Every flash, every electronic pulse had to be timed precisely to avoid detection. Wolff's fingers moved with practiced precision, a ballet of survival in the deadliest environment he had ever faced. As he recorded, Wolff reflected on the magnitude of what he had uncovered. Crane was a conduit, willingly or unwillingly, for the Soviets to ascendiek as a sakin one morphin yantan. Broader strategy. Sokolov's influence, now revealed, indicated the operation extended far beyond Berlin. The CIA's original plan had been simple in design: recruit Sokolov through Crane, reality had warped into something far more complex. A multi-layered KGB counter-operation designed to test, manipulate, and control. The wind shifted, carrying a faint smell of coal smoke from distant factories. Wolf adjusted his coat and slipped further into shadow, careful not to disturb the patterns he had observed. He realized, with grim clarity, that the next stage of operation, Glass Shadow, would demand a level of precision and patience beyond anything he had previously encountered. The city itself had become a weapon, every street a potential threat, every passerby a possible agent. Success depended on observation, timing, and restraint. Hours later, Wolf finally retreated to a secondary safe house. The room was sparsely furnished, heated only enough to prevent frostbite. He spread out his notes, photographs, and recordings. Patterns emerged, connections solidified, and the scope of the KGB's counterintelligence became apparent. They had anticipated Langley's moves, his own surveillance, and Crane's actions. The depth of foresight was terrifying. Wolf leaned back in the chair, eyes tired, mind racing. He had survived another day, collected critical intelligence, and remained undetected. But he knew the operation was now on a knife's edge. One wrong step, one misinterpreted signal, and everything would collapse. Operation Glass Shadow had revealed vulnerabilities in the CIA's approach, exposed the reach and skill of the KGB, and transformed a recruitment mission into a high-stakes game of survival and strategic anticipation. He understood one thing with absolute clarity: the final act was approaching, and Berlin would decide who would emerge as the hunter and who as the hunted. In this city of shadows, every secret carried the weight of nations, and every movement could change the course of history. The dawn in Berlin broke with a pale, almost colorless light, the kind that made shadows long and sharp, cutting through the fog like knives. Michael Wolf moved carefully along the narrow streets, each step measured, each breath deliberate. The city felt alive in a way it never had during daylight, alive with danger, secrets, and unseen eyes. He carried the weight of everything he had witnessed: Crane's handovers, the KGB's orchestration, Sokolov's reluctant compliance, and the countless threads of a network that stretched across continents. He reached the final rendezvous point, a small warehouse by the river's edge. The building was unremarkable from the outside, yet Wolf knew that within, the operation's decisive moment was unfolding. Crane had arrived early, carrying the briefcase one last time. His posture was tense but controlled, every gesture calculated. A man trained to survive under pressure. Wolf observed from the shadows, noting the positions of KGB operatives, stationed in the surrounding alleys and rooftops. Every element had been orchestrated for maximum control. Crane met with Sokolov in the center of the warehouse. Their conversation was muted, body language precise. But Wolf could read the subtle cues. Crane was not entirely in control. Sokolov resisted, yet conceded just enough to satisfy the KGB's plan. Wolf understood immediately. The Soviets had designed this encounter to test loyalties, manipulate actions, and control outcomes. It was a controlled environment, every detail calculated. Wolf activated a small hidden camera, capturing the exchange. Each frame was critical. Each gesture, glance, and movement could confirm whether Crane was acting under coercion or complicity. The KGB's presence was felt but unseen, a web of surveillance and anticipation. Wolf moved silently, positioning himself to remain invisible while gathering crucial evidence. Minutes stretched like hours. The tension in the warehouse was palpable, thick as the fog outside. Wolf noted subtle signs, a slight hesitation in Crane's movements, a micro-expression on Sokolov's face, the ever-present scanning by unseen agents. Every detail mattered. This was not a mission for the faint-hearted. This was a chess game played in real time, where a single wrong move could cost lives and compromise decades of intelligence. Suddenly, a quiet commotion erupted at the back of the warehouse. Wolf instinctively shifted, observing a KGB officer signaling to another. The operation had entered a critical phase. Crane handed over a folder containing highly sensitive documents. Sokolov's compliance, however reluctant, indicated the KGB had succeeded in steering the operation to their advantage, at least partially. Wolf documented everything, knowing that Langley would need this evidence to understand the true scope of the compromise. The moment was delicate. Wolf had to retreat without detection, ensuring that the evidence reached Langley while preserving his cover. One misstep, and the KGB would intercept, and any hope of extracting information from Crane or Sokolov could be lost forever. He moved with precision, slipping through shadows, retracing the route he had scouted days before, mindful of patrol patterns, reflective surfaces, and hidden observers. By the time Wolf reached a safe house on the outskirts of Berlin, the fog had lifted slightly. revealing the muted gray of early morning. He set down the folder, reviewed the recorded footage, and compiled notes on Crane, Sokolov, and the KGB's maneuvers. The depth of the Soviet operation was staggering. They had anticipated not only Crane's actions, but Wolf's every move, orchestrating the environment to control outcomes. Yet Wolf had survived, documented critical intelligence, and preserved the opportunity for Langley to act. In the quiet of the safe house, Wolf allowed himself a moment to breathe. The mission was not complete. The KGB's web extended beyond Berlin, beyond Moscow, and even into Langley itself. But for now, Operation Glass Shadow had reached a pivotal moment. The truth was known, the compromise understood, and the next steps could be planned. The stakes remained high, but intelligence, preparation, and observation had ensured survival, if only just. Wolf leaned back, eyes scanning the foggy skyline visible through the small window. The Cold War was a game without rules, fought in shadows and silence, in whispers and coded gestures. Every decision could shift the balance. Every secret could determine the fate of nations. He had learned that survival depended not on force, but on patience, anticipation, and the meticulous gathering of information. The city was waking now, but Wolf knew that somewhere, across the streets and through unseen corridors, the KGB was already planning its next move, and so was he. Operation Glass Shadow had survived its most dangerous phase, but the War of Shadows continued. And in that war, every step, every glance, and every secret could change history. Wolf exhaled, the fog curling around him like a protective shroud. He had walked through danger, observed the unseen, and documented the truth. The mission was far from over, but he had survived. And in the game of shadows between the CIA and the KGB, survival was victory enough, for now.